Here this morning, if everybody can come in and find their seats, we're going to sing this song, Goodbye World. And goodbye world, I can't stay no longer with you. Goodbye pleasures of sin, I can't stay no longer with you. I made up my mind to go God's way the rest of my life. I made up my mind to go God's way the rest of my life. I made up my mind to go God's way the rest of my life. I made up my mind to go God's way the rest of my life. Let's sing it out. And everybody let's sing. Well, I've never been the same since Jesus saved me. And now I have the power of God within. And day by day I know my life is changing. And I'm so glad that I've been born again. Sing it out. Well, I've never been the same since Jesus saved me. And now I have the power of God within. And day by day I know my life is changing. I'm so glad that I've been born again. Sing it out. So I choose. So I choose to trust Him. Then I choose to praise. One more time. And I choose to trust Him. And I choose to praise. Amen. Let's go to give God praise here in this morning. Amen. If I can have my brother Saul Gonzalez open us in prayer here this morning. Amen. We'd like to thank everybody for coming out here. We're going to be continuing our Memorial Stones Sunday School with Pastor Greg Mitchell up in Prescott. We have a few left to go. I think we have 3 more in total, and then we're going to be moving to another Sunday School. We're going to go ahead and get started with that here this morning.
Bibles, you can turn to the book of Joshua, chapter 4. I have been looking at a series called Memorial Stones. We have today's lesson and 4 more, and we'll bring this to a close. We've been looking at the history of the Prescott Church and the history of our fellowship, and we're learning lessons along the way, and you will understand why we do what we do in many different ways. And so let's get our main verse, Joshua 4 through 7.
Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, 'What do these stones mean to you?' Then you shall answer them, that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. And these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever."
Okay. Silence over there. Okay, we're going to look today at the works in Russia. In 1917, they had what they called the Bolshevik Revolution. This took place in Russia. They were rebelling against the Tsar. And in the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists took over. We have some photos here that speak about this. This is Lenin. He was the leader, one of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution. And this is 1917 when they took over. Next photo here, this is some of their propaganda memorializing this. From that date, communists were in complete control. And one more photo here is that you understand this was extremely bloody. They killed anyone who was a threat anyone who would disagree with them. The communists, when they took over, they hated Christianity. Lenin once called the idea of God an unutterable vileness. And so atheism was the foundation of their communist beliefs, and so they began to persecute Christians. They murdered millions of Christians over the succeeding decades, and the communists enacted laws that forbade Christians to hold services. It was illegal to provide any form of religious instruction to their children. It was absolutely illegal to share the gospel. And when the communists took over, as you know, later on, American politician dubbed this the Iron Curtain. And so it literally, communism kept outsiders away. Wherever communism took over, they kept outsiders out. And of course, that started in Russia and continued in other communist nations. But many Christians, even in spite of persecution, there were Christians in Russia that they continued in their faith anyway. They were not going to stop worshiping God, and those Christians wound up paying a price for that. So this is just background. That was 1917. Now we're going to learn a lesson here, and that lesson is that God prepares people to work His will even later in life. God was not surprised that the communists took over, and God works for the future to work His will. And what He does is He prepares people. Here in Prescott, a young high school student got saved at, I believe, at 15 years old, 15 or 16. His name was Mike Maston. Mike Maston in high school, he had to choose a language to study as one of his courses. What would you like to study? The most common, of course, would be Spanish. There was German, there was French. Mike Maston chose Russian. Now, why? When I went to school, that was not even an option. Russian wasn't even an option, but for some reason, he was interested in the idea, fascinated him, of studying Russian in Prescott, Arizona. Simply because of that, Mike Maston always had an interest in Russia. There was something there. He became a disciple, was later on sent out to pastor, and began to do a work for God. But Mike Maston, no matter where he was, he always had an interest in Russia. In 1987, he was pastoring in Australia, and he actually made some connections with some Russian pastors. I don't even know, that history's gone to me, but in some way, someone gave him the contact information for pastors in Russia, and Mike Maston began writing to them, hoping for an open door. At that time, completely communist, totally illegal, but he simply wrote these men, corresponded a little bit, hoping someday for an open door. But God did this because He works in people long in advance. He was 15, 16 when God put it in his heart. That's really what happened, why he wanted to study Russian. But that was God working His will for later on. The second lesson we learn here is that God is in control of nations. We look, you can read in the paper, oh, look at that terrible thing that happened, this revolution, that despot, this dictator rises. But the Bible says God is in control of nations. And if He's in control, one thing that God does, God opens doors. Revelations 3, verse 8.
See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it.
Okay, this is now, you understand in Revelation, this is God giving an understanding to His believers. He says, this is who God is. God can set before you open doors. God has the ability to do that. November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. You know, the Russians had built this wall separating and dividing Germany and from east and west. And so on November 9, this is actually a photo from that day, is that the Berlin Wall fell. It was not just simply that the wall came down, the communist system was collapsing. This was a brilliant maneuver on the part of Ronald Reagan, a little bit of political lesson when he was negotiating with Gorbachev. The one thing that Gorbachev was insistent, he wanted to get rid of what the media mocked him for, Star Wars. And what was it, SSI or SDI? I don't remember what the initials were. So he realized they're afraid of this, and so he said, absolutely not. Ronald Reagan managed to get, through his decisions, he got Russia to bankrupt themselves, trying to keep up with America. So this is not just simply a physical wall. Communism as a system began to collapse. And then the next photo here, the Iron Curtain is swept aside. East Germany throws open all of its borders. So now nations where it formerly was illegal for foreigners to go in, definitely Christians it was illegal, the doors started opening, and now in former communist nations, the gospel could be preached. Next photo. Here, this is these are some of the scenes from East Germany here, and the fall and the collapse of communism. It completely upended everything, but what happened is the door opened. So whenever doors open in the world, our job is to respond. God's job is to open the doors. Our job is to go through them. We have to respond to that and go through that. So as a natural result, our desire is to preach the gospel. So now we wanted to plant churches in communist nations, former communist nations, including Russia. And so God stirred in Perth, West Australia. Mike Maston studies Russian as a boy in Prescott, is interested, trying to write to these Russian pastors, hoping for an open door. And now the Iron Curtain falls. And so a couple from the Perth church, this is church Lisa and I were from, Rod and Sue McNeil, they were announced in February 1992. They were going to go to Moscow, Russia to plant a church. Next photo. Here is the conference. One of those couples are Rod and Sue McNeil. They're going to go to Moscow, Russia. Mike Maston and Rod McNeil they flew to Russia because the only way that the McNeils could get in, they had to have a visa in advance. Of course, visas are required. The only way it was possible to get a visa, someone in Russia had to sponsor them. So Mike Maston and Rod McNeil flew to Russia hoping to find someone who'd be willing to sponsor them. They land in Moscow. He had the address of one of these pastors that he had written to some years back. He showed it to a taxi driver. Can you take us there? And the man said, that is 110 miles away. But they had to have a visa, so they said, drive us there, we will pay. They drive, it's 110 miles, whatever that is, almost 200 kilometers. They drive to the address that he has on this envelope, and when they arrived at the house, that pastor was home. But what he said to them when he explained who he was, the man said, this is a miracle. This is the only day that I have been home. I have not been home for weeks. I just happened to come and you drove up because God wanted a church in Russia. They explained what their vision was. He briefly told the vision. of our fellowship explained that they were sending the McNeils here to Russia. They pored over maps and looked and explained what they wanted to do in Russia. This man was excited and agreed to sponsor the McNeils so they could get a visa. And so Rod and Sue McNeil came in 1992, began building a church in Moscow, Russia. And I want to tell you that was extremely difficult circumstances. Some of you have no idea how backwards the communist system was. Sue McNeil, every single day, there was no grocery store that you pop down and go to Fry's or whatever your local grocery store. Sue McNeil had to stand in line for hours a day just to get bread, just to get basic necessities, freezing cold below zero. It was very difficult. My hats are off. They're no longer a part of our fellowship, but my hats are off to them trying to build a work in Moscow, Russia, under difficult circumstances. I only have, no, that's somehow I missed, go back. There we go. This photo is the only photo I actually have. This is an impact team that the Perth Church sent to Moscow, Russia, and they went to help Rod and Sue McNeil as they began to build. So we had one worker in Russia. God stirred a pastor in Canada named Glenn Rupchin. God stirred him, put it in his heart to go to Russia. He was excited. He approached his pastor, Dave Marks, and says that, I want to go to Russia. I want you to send us to Russia. And he asked an obvious question. He says, have you asked your wife about that? And he said, no, I haven't. He said, probably you should talk to your wife before we decide to launch you out. And Glenn went and spoke to his wife, Madge, and Madge agreed. They were pioneering in a place called Paradise Hills in Canada. And so 6 months after that initial conversation, they were announced to go to a city called Minsk in Russia. This was out of the Prescott Conference. We have a photo of that conference. Next photo. Go ahead. Somehow they're out of order. Somehow we mixed up the order. Keep on going, next one. Let me see if I can find the right one. Go next. I'm looking for the one for the conference. If you see Pastor Mitchell praying for them, nope, that's not the one. Somehow, I know you'll find that hard. That's actually the third mistake I made this year. So that will be all of it. So in 1993, January conference, they were announced to go. They arrived in Moscow. No, go backwards. These are, so I don't know where the right photo is. Keep going back. Okay, so they were announced to go. They land in Moscow. They are supposed to go to Minsk, which, again, they know nothing about. I have no idea why they chose Minsk, but that was where they were supposed to go. When they landed, they met Rod and Sue McNeil, and for some reason, Rod McNeil said, you should go look at a city called Vologda. He said there is a university there, could be good for young people, and it was a mere 9 hours away. Russia is just a massive nation. I want to tell you, as a pastor, I know something about missionaries. When they get there, they're desperately lonely. The McNeils, it's a hard slog. Often what happens is we announce somebody to go somewhere else, but then when they get there, the missionaries are, you need to come here. We need friends. We need relationship. It would have been the most normal thing in the world for the McNeils to say, you should be here, but for some reason, God moved on Rod McNeil, and he said, you should go look at Vologda. And just on his word, the Rupchins traveled to go look at Vologda, and when they went there, they said, this is where we are going to pioneer. They found an apartment. They began holding services in their apartment. And in this, the daughters, Sherry Lynn and Natalie, they learned Russian very quickly. They started inviting young people to church. Natalie was very musical, and she began to teach Russian young people instruments. They started a music group, and we have some pictures. And here is an outreach. I believe that is Natalie on the drums. That is Glenn Ruption playing the guitar, and that must have been a Russian playing the bass there. But here is an outreach. This is a novelty. These foreigners playing music, and they could gather crowds, and they began to do this, began to outreach on the street. Very quickly, the apartment grew much too crowded, and so they rented a hall in the center of the city. This hall was where they used to teach Russians Marxism. When they would come to set up for church, it had a 10-foot high picture of Lenin on the stage. And so Glenn Ruption used to get a curtain and cover up Lenin so that they could worship God. Glenn was bold. He set up a street meeting in the city, and they needed power for the equipment. He saw a building across the way, and so he went in, and he, in limited Russian, he saw a lady cleaning and asked, could we plug in and use the power from your building to have the outreach? I don't even know if the lady understood what he was saying. She shrugged, like, okay. So he plugged in, and they start doing the outreach. What he does not know is he plugged into the KGB headquarters. And soon 5 KGB agents, these are the secret police, they show up. What are you doing? They tried to arrest him, but a crowd of about 200 people were so hungry and so interested, they began to yell at the KGB and would not let them arrest the Ruptions. We have some more photos here of outreach. Here is Glenn singing on the street. Here is Glenn preaching, and through the help of an interpreter. But Glenn Ruption was bold and began to do this. At that outreach, where they would not be arrested, he wound up praying with people on the street. And so he said, our hall is across the street. If you want to know more, come with me. As they made their way into their hall, about 25 people went over, and he was then able to begin to deal with them more in depth. God began to build this work supernaturally. They had to move buildings. They were growing rapidly. They had to move buildings for various reasons 10 times in the matter of 2 years. Now we have some photos. Next photo here. Here is early photos of the church as they're laboring there. God is saving Russians. Just recently, these people were communists, but now God is doing this. This is a report in the Trumpet. That's Rod and Sue McNeil in the bottom left-hand corner. The Ruptions you see there, that's the family. The second photo from the bottom on the right. And here is my parents. Dad went to preach in Russia, and here they are in Moscow. These are, you see these funny onion domes, all connected with the Russian Orthodox Church. But they began to build this work there. As the Ruptions are laboring now, they're getting these converts. Many of them were very young. One of these was an 18-year-old university student. The university student, he is attending university, and he had one of the professors in some kind of exchange program was a Canadian that they allowed to come and teach in Vologda again. God is working his will. His name was Bruce Maston, and Bruce Maston was a Christian. So he is teaching. God put it in his heart to travel to Russia, to move to Russia and teach. But he wasn't just simply teaching university courses. I don't know if he's an English teacher or what he was doing, but he was witnessing. And one of the students he began to witness to was a young man named Sergei Golubev. Began witnessing to him, and Sergei wanted nothing to do with this, but he kept on. Bruce Maston kept witnessing to him. So Bruce Maston had met the Ruptions, who are also Canadian. They have no connection. They're not from the same church at all. So he took Sergei, began to hear at what the Ruptions were doing. He took Sergei and introduced them to the Ruptions. And so Sergei Golubev started going to church. Sergei worked in a casino. He was a croupier at the casino. He did that by night, and he would go, and when he would say, I have to go to my job, Glenn Ruption said, what job is it? I work in a restaurant. He lied. He was embarrassed to tell him he worked in a casino, but he was drawn. He said he was absolutely fascinated with the Ruptions and the love that they had. They're telling about Jesus. So he is going to church on Sunday and Wednesday, working in a casino. He says he's still getting drunk on Friday, but he got sick of this. He said, I can't keep living this life. And he decided, I am going to quit drinking, number one, and number two, this high-paying job at a casino. I am tired of working in a casino. I'm going to quit. He is with the Ruptions at 6 p.m., and Glenn reminded him, it's time to go to work. And he said, I've been lying to you. I haven't been working at a restaurant. I work at a casino, but tonight I'm quitting. And he did that. He quit and began living for Jesus, started getting involved, and as a natural result is God dealt with him, and Sergei Golubev felt called to preach. Here's the next lesson that we have. You never know what the person you are witnessing to may become. We should witness because everyone who's not saved needs to get saved. But think about this. A man named Bruce Maston is witnessing to a young man simply because he needs Jesus. But you never know the person you witness to, what they may become. Next photo. Here is Sergei Golubev pulling his first altar call. And here, Bruce Maston witnessed to him. The Ruptions followed that up. He gets saved, but now he felt called to preach. Young people started getting saved in the church in Vologda, and many of those young people, later on, they would become pastors and leaders in the Russian fellowship. Next photo is here we have, this is Sergei and Oksana Pahovsky. He told me red coats were very chic at that time, apparently in Russia. But here they are when they first get saved and wound up getting married. Later on, they became pastors. Next photo is here. There is a young Alexander Shevelyov, and this is his wife, Natalia, and their family. Alexander got saved. He's a young teenager, but during church, even though he had responded, he was a young little rebel. He would sit at the back and make jokes and was causing problems and distracting. And so Glenn Ruption, one night, he asked him, he says, I want you to leave. You cannot continue to act like this in church. And he said, whenever you decide you want to serve God, then you come back. But for now, I want you to leave. You have to go. He said he left angry. Glenn Ruption had to speak through an interpreter to tell him this. He was very angry that he was asked to go. But he had genuinely gotten saved. He just was a young punk kid, full of rebellion. He storms away, but as he is walking away, he then thought to himself, am I going to destroy my salvation and destroy my life because of pride? And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. Went back to Glenn Ruption, and he apologized. And because of that, Glenn allowed him to continue attending church. Sergei says there was just a tremendous atmosphere of revival in the church. He said during that time, so many young people are getting saved, but he said when people would get saved, the boys wanted to become pastors, the girls wanted to become pastors' wives. We have a quote here. Sergei Golubev said, if someone said he didn't know he was called to preach, we thought something was seriously wrong, because what else was there to do in life other than preach the gospel? Have a next photo. And the next photo here is the early days. On the left there, that is Glenn and Madge Ruption, who are pioneering the church. And there is Evgeny, they call him Genya. Genya wound up marrying their daughter, Sherry Lynn. The Yusanovs. There is a young Sergei Golubev and Anya, and then another couple on the right. This is very, very early days, but God was doing something powerful. And what Glenn Ruption began to do is he started planting churches. From the beginning, he had put into them, remember the vision of our fellowship is get people saved. First of all, they got to be converted. Make them disciples. Teach them, train them, impart a vision for preaching the gospel, train them in-house, but then our vision is plant churches. And so the very first couple that they planted was Sergei and Anya Golubev, and they planted them into a city called Sokol. Here we have some photo. There is a young Sergei, that is Anya peeking over his shoulder. Here's some of their first converts. This was the very first indigenous church. A Russian went to preach the gospel, and it worked exactly like it worked. Sergei at that time was 20 years old. Anya was 17 when they went to pioneer this church. The next photo here is an impact team that they sent from Vologda to go and help them there in Sokol. Second couple that were sent out was Genya and Sherry Lynn Yusanov, and they went to a city called Rybinsk. Next photo is white. It was snowy there. That's why. Oh, there we go. No, keep going. That's the wrong way. Keep going the other way. There we go. This is in Rybinsk. That is Genya Yusanov. Remember, he's married to the Ruption's daughter. That is him there on the stage. That's actually Sherry Lynn is playing the piano there. On the top left, that's an early picture of their church. On the right, if I remember right, he said that is either an impact team or these are people that they were sending to go to some kind of meeting in Vologda. The third couple that were sent out was Sergei and Oksana Pohovsky, and they were sent to a city called Kostroma. Kostroma was actually planted. Tucson planted a church. Steve and Shirley Anderson, they went to this city called Kostroma. They had been pioneering, building this work for some time, and again, for an American to move to Russia, God bless the Andersons that they responded to the will of God, and Pastor Warner responded and sent them there. And so the third couple planted out, the Pohovskys, they took over this church from Steve and Shirley Anderson when they left. Next photo here. That's them. Okay, so this is now, again, this is the Pohovskys, and here are some of their early converts, and they're laboring, building a work in Kostroma. As the church began to be built in Russia, many pastors and many evangelists went. We send workers. This is part of our vision, is we send other workers, or pastors go themselves to preach and impart a spirit. We have Dave Marks. Dave Marks was the one who planted the Ruptions. Next photo. And here is Dave Marks. Through the years in many different places, he is preaching and helped guide the church in Russia from the beginning, was extremely instrumental. Next photo, we have Here is Steve Bowman on the right preaching in Vologda, that he went to labor there. Pastor Nigel Brown went to preach. Pastor Nigel Brown there is breaking the law. Illegal for a foreigner to go and preach on the street, but he's doing it anyway. And so we did this. Next photos. The next photo here is they decided to do a men's rally. And so Pastor Mitchell and Harold Warner went, gathering of men, and they met in Moscow, and they began to labor. That is the very first men's rally that they did. Next photo is Pastor Mitchell praying for the sick, and this is in one of these. I think that's actually in the first men's rally, and then in later years I would join Pastor Mitchell. Next photos, we have several of them. Next one. Here is now in the men's rally. I went with Dad, started going every year, and just the work, the growth that God did is just incredible. And so we began to do that, imparting a spirit. Now, I want you to understand that works. So the door swung open. We were able to send workers, but then communism, the bear began to rise again. Communism reestablished its hold. And I want you to understand, in all the churches that they plant, it is in an atmosphere of pressure, because they never know when someone may report them, and then the police or the KGB. We actually have a video. This is of the KGB or the police in a city. Okay, so this is in a city called Sevastopol, but this is actually what they face. What they're doing is illegal now. Communism reestablished the hold. It is illegal, and that is not uncommon, that at any moment someone reports them, the police, the secret police can burst in at any time, and they can be questioned, they can be arrested, and that has happened. So they're laboring to build a work in Russia. Let's talk secondly about Russian international church planting. Remember, our vision is converts, get people saved, make disciples, train them, plant churches, which is what they began to do in Russia. But the fourth part of our vision is plant churches in other nations. That is what we call missions, or international church planting. And so Russia carried on that vision. That is all throughout our fellowship. From Russia, they planted their first international church into Odessa, Ukraine, and we have some photos here. This is the Pahovskys, that they went to the Ukraine and began to build a work for God. That's Sergei behind the pulpit, and here are some of the people. And that was a milestone. That was the first Russian pastor ever planted outside of Russia. The second church that they planted was in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. And we have a photo here. This is now from a conference. All these people, apart from Sergei, and you see Juan Pablo Cardo, who was preaching at a conference, they are all Mongolians. Think about that. Some of you couldn't find Mongolia on a map, but Russians went there and began to plant churches. The first couple, Alexander and Lyuba Ofitsarov, went to Mongolia and established, and God's doing a powerful work in Mongolia. Russia planted a church in Vietnam. You know, for many years, Americans, because of the war, were absolutely not welcome. No way we could plant a church, but they liked Russians because Russians helped in the war. The very first church, or one of the first churches that we were able to plant in Vietnam is in Vietnam, and that man went to, then later on took the church in Cambodia from the Myolas. In 2010, Sergei and Oksana Pokhovsky went to Havana, Cuba. And again, a former communist nation. That is Havana in the background. Here they are, one of the early converts, the third couple ever sent out, first couple international, and now they went to Cuba. Went to Cuba, the same problem that Americans faced in Russia. He has to have a visa. You need someone to sponsor you. So they arrived in country trying to find and could not get a visa. So he went on a fast. He fasted for 2 weeks. The end of a 2-week fast, he met a Russian lady who had married a Cuban. She had been there for 24 years. She had a company, and she agreed to hire him as a technical advisor. He said, I knew nothing about what it was, my job description, but simply God moved on this woman and gave him a visa that was able to be renewed every year. Now, communism was very strong in Cuba. They were not able to street preach, began to witness. One person who got witnessed to would invite their friends and often would then invite them to their house where he could, the Pokhovskys could then witness to their friends and family. And they started a Bible study. We have the photo. This is the very first Bible study that they started in Cuba. Think about this. We plant in Canada. Canada plants in Russia. Russia plants in Cuba. This is the very first one. He said many of these people that came, originally many of these were employees of that Russian lady. She was making them come to church. Some of them did not actually even survive in salvation. He said he would get a group of people, they would dwindle away. He had to move to another house, and he said he started Bible study in 5 different houses. He is desperate, so again he starts fasting for a breakthrough, and he needed a locksmith. And for a problem he had, a locksmith came, he met this man, witnessed to him, and invited him to a movie that they're showing. They had dubbed the movie Fireproof, which you know is about a troubled marriage, unbeknownst that young man that he met, their marriage was in trouble, and this couple came and attended. Their names were Alejandro and Yemi Fernandez Perez. They came and they got saved at this movie Fireproof, and they asked Sergei, start a Bible study in our house. And we have a photo. This is the 6th Bible study on the right. That is Alejandro and Yemi. That is their house. And here, the 6th Bible study that he starts. Now he started getting real converts. And they started sticking. The church began to grow because of communism. There were no buildings that you could rent. All buildings were owned by the government. You can't go to the government, hi, what I'm doing is illegal. Can I rent a church? You know, I'm going to start a church. That's just not possible. They found an abandoned house, and it had a massive living room. It was owned by 2 brothers that were alcoholics, but somehow God moved on their heart and let them move into this abandoned house that they renovated, and they started having church in there, rent-free. It could seat 70 to 80 people. We have some photos of the church in Cuba. Here is the work that God began to build. Next one. I think we have more photos. These are they began to build. I think there's one more. Completely illegal. One person would get saved. Their marriage would get help. They would testify to friends. People started getting healed, and they were able to do that. Sergei was out driving, and a man ran in front of his car and arrested. It was not his fault. Clearly, the man ran in front of him. He had a lawyer, and the lawyer said, this is so plain, there's no problem, you're going to get off. But the problem was, the word had spread to the Cuban version of the KGB, the secret police, and so instead of getting off, he wound up getting sentenced to prison. And Sergei Pahovsky wound up going to prison for 1 year. He was supposed to, according to the judge's order, he was supposed to be sent to a labor camp that would be like a minimum. Sent him to a maximum security prison for the worst offenders, murderers, different people. We have a photo. His wife, Oksana, that's the prison that he was locked up in. His wife was allowed to visit him once every 21 days. And that is an actual photo of one of the times when she was able to visit. Sergei began to do gardening and started just working. He's got time on his hands, started working in the prison on the landscaping. A high-ranking general came, asked, who is doing that gardening? And they said, it's this Russian. He was impressed by that, sent a letter to the commandant of the warden, prison warden essentially, and for 3 days. That had never happened in that maximum security prison. He said it was so unprecedented. The first time that he walked out of the gates, all of the convicts started cheering. This was an absolute miracle. For 3 days, and they would have church for 3 days, and then he had to go back. Turned the church over officially to Alejandro and Yemi Fernandez Perez. We have a photo. This is him. He has just gotten out of prison. Couple who had gotten saved, had been discipled, and now they are going to be pastoring. The work of God continues in Cuba. We have some photos. Next photo here is the church in Cuba. Numbers of these converts. I think there's one more page of photos. Here is Sergei Golubev preaching in Cuba. There's Dave Marks preaching in Cuba. And our brother from Spain, Alberto, preaching in Cuba. But not only that, they started going to the conference in Russia, but of course this is very difficult in order to be able to plant churches, and so they discussed it with me, and we said, yes, let them plant churches directly. They don't have a full conference, but we let them plant churches. Here is the very first church that they planted out. We have a video. So think about this. This is our vision, is a native Cuban who's a convert, who'd been discipled, is now discipling himself, and it works. Amen. It's not just a Prescott thing. This is what God does, and the work in Cuba continues. The work of God in Russia continues to move on. They are, for the past year to 18 months, you know, there's been the war going on in Ukraine. They've been locked out. We haven't been able to have pastors, many pastors go in. But what God is doing is that many of their churches are having waves of young people, to where they're having like 100 visitors a night of young people getting saved. We have a concert in Vologda. We have a video. Here's the altar call. 85 young people came that night. And that is Sergei Golubev's son is the one pulling the altar call that night. This is what God is doing. Russia now has planted churches in Cuba, Armenia, Vietnam, Mongolia, Israel, Georgia, Serbia, China, Romania, Ukraine, Cambodia, Uzbekistan, Belarus, Moldova, Lithuania, Crimea, and Egypt. The international works that God has done. Thank God. Now, of those nations, not all of those works named. It's very, very tough going. The pastor that went to Belarus, you understand Belarus is the been very helpful to Russia in the war in Ukraine. The pastor was raided by the police. They beat him and arrested him, held him for a few weeks, and then they deported. Here's a photo of this pastor as they're able to make it out. This is when they land back in Russia. And so this is what vision that we want to preach. Last conference, they just had their conference in August, September, I can't remember which month, just recently, is they planted a new work into Port Said, Egypt, our very first work in Egypt. We have a photo. Here is this couple, a Russian couple, are going to Egypt from a communist nation to a Muslim nation, preaching the gospel. I want to tell you, our vision works, and it works all over the world. There are currently 47 churches that we have in the nation of Russia, and there are another 14 churches that they have planted in
Testing 1, 2, there we go. Go ahead.
The power of God open doors where it seems to the man is not there. And the impossible become possible. And I don't understand how as humans so limited in our mind, we also not only limit us, but limit God of what He can do to us. And I think if we really believe that, we be like a those men. I will go. Here I am. And anywhere, anytime. Because God, when God comes, He will never go leave that person. Never go abandon. Never go ignore the circumstances that He's going to face. Because He's going to be there to open doors, to destroy all obstacles. And to me, that requires faith. Truly trusting God. Truly blindfolded, Father God. And it's my heart is so awesome.
Absolutely it is. So I said this before, that when I first went out and I pastored my first church, I took over a church, the pastor told me, the revival that you're looking for starts right here. This is where it starts. Is this inspired? Are you desired here to go out and do what you've seen us do? And so what you see up there is God placed an open door in these men's hearts. And they said, we're going to follow through. And you see the revival that's been happening. Many people in today's churches, and I'm going to say this because, I kind of grew up in the same era that George did, and that some of us others have. I mean, you're talking revival. At one time, the church was kicking at almost a consistent basis of 700 people. I mean, almost consistent. And people left and right going out and going out and going out. We were seeing gangsters, okay? We were seeing military. We were seeing normal people, if you want to call them normal. I mean, we were seeing everybody come, young people come and giving their life to Jesus, one after the other, after the other, after the other. The only thing that has changed is the desire here. That's the only thing that has changed. So my question would be, if you listen to this, what our pastors are imparting, are we allowing it to take a hold? Because that's what's going to start the flame out there again. The desire in our hearts. There's many places in Yuma. There's many places to step foot on and say, as God says, my soul stepped here, this is my land, and I'm taking it. So let the desire run wild and see what happens. Because we have Naaman overseas. We have the Bravos overseas. Did they ever think they were going there? Probably not. But they're already launching churches. Naaman launched 2 churches. What will happen on those they speak to? The desire is already there. I like what our brother said in our men's class. It's not about the fight, the dog, how big the dog is. It's about how much big the fight is in you. Are you willing to step up and go, you know what? I bite harder because I got God with me. So these revivals aren't done. Let's revive this and let's see what God will do. And we will see people rise back up and sent back out. Who knows what nation they're going to? There is someone else in Yuma who's ready to go to a nation we can't even see on the map. Let's believe in God for that. Let's see what God will do. We're going to get ready to start our service. We have Pastor Mike Bethea here from El Cajon. Let's get ready to enjoy a good service this morning.